Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here for our China panel, and I know there's been some anticipation for this panel, and people have expressed an interest from the time I've arrived in Mumbai from Shanghai. I've been asked about the ongoing twin meetings in Beijing and what this means for China, what this means for India. And so there's a great deal of interest. But this time I'm very excited, and indeed I'm honored to have such an illustrious panel. And we will tap into their expertise for two reasons, and I hope we can structure it in two parts. One is just to understand what is going on, and I'm going to seek your expertise to help us interpret what's going on and how to make sense of what's going on. And the second part, the actual mandate assigned to this panel, is engaging China, the geoeconomic giant. So how exactly do we engage China with events as they unfold? So I will just some opening remarks to paraphrase Winston Churchill, who spoke about Russia. So China is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So we're all trying to understand China and to unravel the layers. And regarding the ongoing meetings, the most common question I've been asked the last 2 days is Xi Jinping going to be president for life? Or has he been crowned emperor? And I have to quote Chairman Mao, who was asked about the French Revolution. What do you think of the French Revolution? His response: "It's too early to tell." So I'm just going to have to say it's too early to tell right now. A lot can happen in 5 years, or 10, or 15, as long as he chooses to stay. But right away, I would caution against these broad brush strokes. Like emperor is it's not a correct analogy, because the imperial dynasties had different governance models. So yes, there are elements of Leninism, because the party is at the core of the nation, and Xi Jinping is officially the core of the party. And there is some neo-statism, some Stalinism. There's probably the cultural revival, the national rejuvenation has some echoes of, I don't know, probably Ataturk and lots of other people today. So there are elements and there are echoes of many things from the past. But fundamentally, something new is going on. Xi Jinping is a new phenomenon in international relations, and this is a new China. And we all know the baseline statistics. We know the GDP figures and the projected growth rate, and we know the social indicators are doing well. We know the debt to GDP ratio. We know these indicators. Everyone in this audience is very familiar with that. And then the larger trends are what has happened in the last 5 years, the power consolidation by the party, and specifically by Xi Jinping. The 19th Party Congress was a definitive defining moment. The party constitution had Xi Jinping thought on socialism with new Chinese characteristics for a new era inscribed in it. And this week, the national constitution, the state constitution, was amended. So this is one set of changes in the arc as we see it. And there's the ongoing anti-corruption campaign, which has had far-reaching consequences. And there are broader economic trends. The most visible and the most obvious is the Belt Road Initiative. It was called One Belt, One Road. It's now the Belt Road Initiative, Idai Ilu. What do we make of this? What implications does this have for China and for Asia, for India, and for the world? So let me begin. Let's get right to it. And I want to begin with the intimate and the familiar, like the inside view of China, and then move to the regional and the global trends. So I think I will begin with Prakash Menon. So Prakash, you lived in China for 20 years, and before you moved back to India. And during your time in China, you've traveled to most of the provinces, set up hundreds of NIIT centers across China. And this was the first Indian WOFE, wholly owned foreign enterprise. So you were welcomed everywhere. And this was also a first of sorts because it's one of the first major investments in the sacred education space. So in China, the education space is very sacred. It's the inner sanctum, and very few people are allowed inside. And NIIT was successful. Now, what has changed? Has something changed? Is this a new China? Has something changed on the ground and at the official levels?
Yeah, I think many things have changed, but we'll talk about 5 of them. One is the Chinese push, a renewed push for global legitimacy. We've not seen that in the past as much as we're seeing it now. That's number 1. Number 2 is this factor 11. I think one of our newsreaders called him 11, which is the godlike status of President Xi Jinping, is something new, and I think that will change the face of what I call the Red Family, which is the Communist Party. 3 is, there is a huge push in the digital space. So once the country has become the factory of the world, they're looking at the digital space, which is the factory of the future. And therefore, they've coined a term which is called Industry 4.0. It's not been fairly well defined as to what it is. And they're seeking help from all of us in defining it for them. But I would tend to feel it'll be in the area of artificial intelligence, robotics, IoT, and so on. Big data. So there are very big initiatives that are coming up in these areas. And it will impact India because in the early 80s and the 90s when we tried to build the IT industry, we didn't have much competition in the space. But I think things have changed. Now in the digital space, we also see another movement, which is in the area of the whole cyber area. Organized cyber hacking, where university students participate. Organized interference in the cyber area, which has got to do, as an example, fake news, putting fake news into other nations. We see that coming up in China. And finally, the 5th big change is I think they're also having a big cultural push. So we see a lot of Confucius institutions opening in many, many nations. So these are some shifts that I notice, which can impact living in China and working in China.
And you have been able to observe this even after you came back here, just with NIT's ongoing work on the ground?
That is right.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. And we'll come back to some of these points, of course. And I'm also hoping you are formulating your questions because we're hoping this will be a participatory panel. Ryan, the next question is for you because you are based in Hong Kong and you'll spend time in Beijing. And for the last 12 years, you have been collating the documents and the speeches coming out of Beijing. You've been organizing these flow charts of the decision making in the party, and so you've been a Beijing observer from the inside. And Ryan, you were on the job. How did you let this happen?
I think you should define inside there a little more carefully.
Well,
perhaps.
anyway, so I'm going to ask you about the constitutional amendments that everyone's concerned about this week. And specifically, could you talk about the term limit changes, the National Supervisory Commission, and the court status of socialism and the party in national life?
So you want me to talk about the core status of the party in national life?
National life and...
Get all the bad questions.
No, you will talk about the term limits, please, and the National Supervisory Commission, and just help us interpret this change. So there is a change. What is this change, and what should we make of it?
Sure, I think that's a terrific question. There's 2 parts to China. There's the party side, and then there's the government side. And there's sort of 2 trains that run parallel, and almost everybody is a party member, and then they also have their job, which is their second train. And so you spend your life jumping between train to train. And so what Xi has done is basically, he controls one of these trains much more than the other. He's the leader of the party, he's the core of the party. And so the meetings we're seeing at the moment is the other train, it's the government side. And so what he's done is he's used the rules, so he's done it legitimately, but he's changed it so that sort of term limits, which was one of the things that bound that other train, as in his ability to stay nominally on top of that train. And he's just said like, well, now there are no more term limits. So in terms of the presidency, that actually it's the same thing when we look at these. The supervisory commission is a way of making people do their job. And so before you had to sort of fulfill your party requirements, which means you have to be a member and you have to go to meetings once a week and you study Xi Jinping thought, and it's pretty dull. And then you have your government requirements, which is that you provide a hospital or you teach your classes properly or you do your other things. And so what the supervisory commissions do is before, as long as you sort of turned up and you followed the party rules, you were judged on how well you ran the hospital or you taught, right? That other train, in essence, became like a way of measuring performance. Now, these supervisory commissions, what they do is they use these party measurements to determine if you're any good at your job or not. So in other words, they're blurring together these sort of tracks that used to run together all the time. So it's the same thing with the president for life, is that what it does is it takes the part of the system, the part that Xi Jinping controls much more, and it applies it to your daily life that bit more. And so why is he doing this? He's doing this because for the last few years he's been complaining that people don't listen to what he says enough. Not in the sense of they don't listen, they all go to their weekly meetings and they study Xi Jinping thought and all those things, but people aren't implementing the things that he says. So in the short term, this doesn't actually make a huge amount of difference because everything's going to function the same way. You've always had these two trains. But in the longer term, what you're going to see is this sort of blending together. It's changing the way the whole thing functions. Because if you're starting to use more of these party tracks and you're starting to make everybody do what Xi Jinping says, then Xi Jinping has to tell you what he wants. So unlike this idea that Prakash was talking about, where they say something vague like, Industry 4.0, why don't you tell me what Industry 4.0 means for me? And then you judge whether you like Prakash's interpretation of Industry 4.0. Now instead you have to be told, this is Xi Jinping's interpretation of Industry 4.0. So in the longer term, what it means is actually he can be held accountable for something going wrong. Whereas previously, if something went wrong, it was never the vague sort of, oh, well, I told you Industry 4.0 is a thing. You just defined it wrong. You implemented it wrong. So Xi is, in essence, sort of personifying power. And he's taking quite a large risk in doing so. I mean, he's sort of, if you wear the crown, you have to bear the cross. So he's sort of put this crown on his head and said, I'm the president, I'm the general secretary, I'm in charge of the military, everybody has to do what I say. But in the long run, everyone will also expect him to make good on some of these promises, which if you're in some town in the middle of nowhere and your school's not running so well or you can't pay to see a doctor, is a risk. Whereas previously that would be, well, my township head is bad, but Xi Jinping is good.
Yes, exactly. So one wonders why he took what he believes is a calculated risk. So we'll come back also. I'm glad you touched upon the vulnerabilities that he's opened himself to. Apart from the very skillful and stunning marshalling of resources and taking up every available position that was, that was open. So you've touched upon both. So we'll come back to that as well. And now moving on to Claude Smadja. You co-founded World Economic Forum, and that was a pioneering space for the value of dialogue and engaging all the geoeconomic actors. And I believe that's a very valuable space and way of engaging actors. This year at Davos, China created a situation and the world responded very favorably as the beacon of globalization. So Xi Jinping's thoughts on globalization, shall we say, captured everyone's imagination. But at the same time, you know very well, as a long-time observer of China and as a frequent visitor to China, you know that they're marshalling all the state resources and to achieve their targets, whether it's governing FDI or governing overseas investment or the internal restructuring, their currency, their engagement with... So the party and the state are present in everything, and then at the same time, China wants to be the beacon of globalization. So I would like your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Indira, and first of all, thanks to Gateway House for so kindly inviting me here and allow me to learn a lot and also to share some thoughts with you. I think we need to take a step backward. We need to understand what is happening in China, and we need to understand the context in which, and people in Davos last year were indulging once again in wishful thinking because the concept of globalization that Xi Jinping was outlining has nothing to do with the concept of globalization that the European or the Americans want to push forward. And this leads me back to the global picture. What is it? China has reached an inflection point. And this inflection point is the convergence of three dramatic qualitative changes. Qualitative changes with respect to the economy. China has achieved now this kind of critical mass where it is the #1 economy in purchasing power parity. It represents more than 19% of the global GDP. And so it is going into the second phase of its assertiveness in the economy. The issue, Industry 4.0 is a technical point. What counts is what is happening with Made in China 2025. Made in China 2025 is a deliberate strategy with a lot of resources allocated to it to achieve a dominant position on all the commanding heights of the global economy of the 21st century, identifying the 10 key sectors where China wants to have 70% of local input. This is one point. The second point is moving from manufacturing to services and a consumer-oriented economy. This is one point. Second point, China has reached the point where today it feels that it can play equal partner with the United States. In October 2013, when Xi Jinping met Obama in California, he said something extremely important, but it was dismissed as a kind of Chinese rhetoric. He said, I want to create a new model of relations between great nations. What does that mean? Very simply, it meant I might not be as yet on an equal footing with you on an economic domain, but from now on, I am dealing with you on an equal footing basis. This is very important. And this has two key elements. One is what China is doing in the South China Sea, because any emerging global power wants to own its region. This is what the United States did with the Monroe Doctrine, and Mr. Tillerson reasserted the Monroe Doctrine 10 days ago. And so China feels that it has to own the Asia-ASEAN region. The second point, which is very important, as has been mentioned, is the Belt and Road Initiative. What does it mean? It means that China wants not only to have for the first time a sphere of geopolitical influence, but it wants to create a sphere of co-prosperity with China as its center. And then comes Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping sees it as his raison d'etre, the kind of thing that would put him in the history books as the man who, more importantly than Mao Zedong, restored China at the right center of a global landscape. This is why this move about the elimination of the two terms limitation, because quite simply, he feels that he needs more than the next 5 years to do that. And he wants to have his hand free, and he wants to be in a protocol domain, able to assert that when he is dealing with a head of state. It entails some risk, so be it. Xi Jinping is a very bold man. He has never been afraid to take risk. He will take that risk. And so this is what we need to understand. We are dealing today with a China which has crossed a threshold. And so any of our criteria in dealing with China, as we thought we could deal with China even 5 years ago, are completely obsolete.
I find myself having to agree with you, actually. I have lived in China for 10 years, and if I see the arc, I do agree. I went there right before the Beijing Olympics, where there was a charm offensive to show that we are eager to participate in the world. And now I think it's taken a different trajectory. And you have emphasized the personal dimension, apart from the Chinese government and the party perspective. There is a strong personal dimension, you say. So we'll come back to that.
Just one sentence
Sure.
to add. You have to understand one thing. For the Chinese, the 10 years of the Hu Jintao era were a lost decade. And for them, Hu Jintao, and it was true, was a very weak leader, and this form of consensus, of power by consensus, for many Chinese, led to a loss of waste of resources and time. Xi Jinping doesn't want to hear any more about leadership by consensus. For him, it is a waste of time, it is a waste of energy, and it is almost a crime against the potential of China. We need to understand that point very clearly.
Thank you. And we will revisit these points. Mr. Doitoshinori, you sit in a vantage point as head of research in Ministry of Finance, and you know China well, you know Japan well, you know East Asia, and you also bring in this experience with global institutions as well as forums like the G20. I want to just cut right to the chase, and using all of this expertise, I want to ask you about IDA-ILO, about the Belt Road Initiative. I want to ask you, because Japan has been a pioneer in Asian infrastructure investment for several decades. So Japan is a pioneer in peacetime. Of course, the United States was a pioneer too, but Japan pioneered peacetime infrastructure investment in Asia. And to a large extent, these have been good investments, and we don't have project-by-project statistics, but overall, it appears to be financially viable. It makes economic sense. Why is BRI different? Why is the Belt Road Initiative different? Why does it elicit so much anxiety across sectors, even among the participating countries? 68 countries have signed up, even among the participating countries along the overland route and the maritime Silk Road. What is this about? Why is this different from the Japanese model, or is it about norms? Is it about operations? Your thoughts on this, please.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very interesting panel. The question was about the Belt Road Initiative, Why it is so different? It's hard for me to make any knowledgeable observation because I'm not part of the Chinese government. But nevertheless, I would like to offer my view, and this is my personal view, and this is not the view of the institutions that I belong to. Well, everybody knows that Asia is in need of infrastructure investment. Recent publication by the Asian Development Bank indicates that the potential need for investment on infrastructure would be in the order of $1.5 trillion a year. So if Belt Road Initiative were carried out in a very good manner, I think there's a good potential that BRI would play a very constructive role in building the infrastructures in the Asian region. But the recent developments in some of the specific cases that we hear, I don't really claim to know too much about the individual incidents, but for example, for those who are interested, I would recommend you to take a look at this the report that came out by the Gateway House, which is titled Chinese Investments in India's Neighborhood. I just took a look at this report yesterday, but it was very interesting in a sense that it described some of the recent projects that was done under the BRI, which caused various problems in this region. And in the case of some port projects in Sri Lanka, the essence of the problem was that the Chinese government made a big loan to the Sri Lankan government, and they created a port, but the economic use seemed to be quite limited, so it didn't generate any cash flow. So eventually, Sri Lankan government got into debt trouble, and so in order to, in an effort to repay other part of the debt, they agreed to lease the operating right of the port to the Chinese SOE, I believe, for 99 years. And this caused a lot of, created a lot of attention. And I guess, what this means is that the way that the Belt Road Initiative projects are carried out right now, it may not end up benefiting the borrowing countries as well as the regional economy. So, in my view, what is necessarily needed in carrying out these projects is first, which is obvious, is that the projects that are being financed by BRI should be projects that make economic sense. And we at the G20 agreed that infrastructure projects supported by public funds should not be just simply infrastructure projects, but they should be high quality infrastructure projects, which could mean many things, but at least it should be cost-efficient projects throughout its project life cycle. So if it doesn't generate any returns and doesn't make economic sense, maybe it was a project that shouldn't have been financed in the first place. And the second issue is that a due consideration has to be made in the debt sustainability of the borrowing countries. Of course, to make sure that you can repay the loan would be the burden, a primary burden of the borrowing country. But at the same time, there's something that we call lenders' responsibilities. And obviously, if the public sector is going to make this lending, the lenders should also make sure that the borrowing country will be able to repay the loans. And the third important, I think, aspect is that the projects that are funded by public funds should be open. And in the case of Sri Lankan port, we don't really know what's going to happen, but it's very important that those infrastructures will be open to other countries, other businesses, so that it would benefit the economy in the region and the international economy as well. And in order to ensure that all these happen, what is most important is making sure that transparency is there. And at this moment, the lending activities by some of the state-owned Chinese banks seem to be classified as a state secret. So we really don't know which banks are lending to which countries, how much, on what projects, and on what kind of terms. So it is important that transparency should be there, and so everybody should be able to verify what is actually going on. So what is creating all this anxiety is that we don't really know what is the standard that has been adopted by the Chinese in carrying out these projects. And in the past, not in the past, but the rest of the world, we are conducting this kind of public financing under certain standard and norms, which is centered around various guidelines adopted by OECD or various safeguards standards adopted by international financial institutions such as World Bank, ADB, and AIIB. And also, if there's a debt problem, there's this Paris Club agreement that everybody refers to. But the Chinese are not part of those existing arguments, so, I mean, existing guidelines and norms. So the challenge for the international community, I think, is to make sure that we can establish some sort of standard and norms that even the Chinese government can comply. And so thereby, so there's going to be some transparency in understanding what the Chinese are doing in this Belt Road Initiative. And I believe that since China is also part of the G20, I think G20 could be a very good forum for the international community to discuss these issues and perhaps agree on a new set of standards of norms so that Belt Road Initiative could be a blessing to the region as well. And I guess there's a big room for the Chinese to buy into these kind of things, because if there's going to be too much troubled projects under the Belt Road Initiative, I think it doesn't do, it hurts the reputation of this Belt Road Initiative. And so over time, I think it would also be beneficial for the Chinese to agree on a certain set of international standards and norms so that those projects could be beneficial, not only to the Chinese, but to the borrowing country and the rest of the world.
Thanks very much. You've raised several good points, and just collating all the thoughts that came up. So legitimacy is a topic to be discussed, and the prestige, restoring the personal prestige of China. Transparency and trust, the two are related. So the lack of transparency and the trust deficit. And as Ryan mentioned, finally, if there's no one else left to take the fall should something go wrong. So this feeds into the trust deficit, automatically feeds into the vulnerabilities and the exposure that China has now set itself for. I'm going to quickly segue through your points. I'm going to ask a question to Claude Smadja. China actually is not a new kid on the block. They've been in international institutions from the very beginning, right? So even before World War II and post-World War II. So I want to ask you, in the G20, they are a member of G20, they appear to be a responsible stakeholder in all the international institutions and forums. And yet we are talking about the trust deficit. So I would like you to address China in international institutions and international forums, but the Chinese-led initiatives such as AIIB and NDB and SEO, and let's say the OECD or G7-led initiatives, the traditional institutions, the bank and the fund and WTO and the others.
I think you are touching an extremely important point. But again, we need to take one step back to understand what is going on. Until now, and this now is becoming a little bit of a common recognition, until now, we have been operating in the last 35 years under the wrong assumption that as China would develop, it would converge. And let us be very blunt. I'm sorry, despite all the efforts of my mother, I could not be a diplomat. Let us be very frank. This wishful thinking was just the illustration of the arrogance of the Western world. Let us remember there was the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and there was this moment when you had even this rubbish book about the end of history. And then people said, and then people say, I mean, there is only one system in the world, and China will join that system because there is no other system. And the Chinese, you need to give them justice, has always been very honest. Even when they entered WTO, they said, our goal is to build a socialist market economy. And everybody in the world, all the pundits and the Harvard professor were saying, a socialist market economy cannot exist. But this is what they are doing. And so today we are at the point where the illusion that not only a big country, but the biggest power in the history of the world would just seamlessly fit into the shoes which were designed when it was a negligible part of the global landscape. And what Xi Jinping is saying today is, guys, these are your rules. They were designed when I didn't exist. Now I exist, and I am big, 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 big. And we need to rediscuss the rules. And interestingly enough, what is happening for the first time in the world is that the leaders of the two big countries in the world want to rediscuss the rules, but of course for completely different reasons. Trump is saying, I have been elected by the losers of globalization. I want to review the rules of globalization. And Xi Jinping is saying, I want to review the rules not because I am representing the losers, but because these rules don't fit a country my size with my requirements and my priorities. And so the Chinese will not converge, and of course, we will not converge to China. And so when we discuss these international institutions, the key issue is not to find something here and something there. In many aspects, many elements of WTO are obsolete. We need to recognize that. Many elements of the IMF are completely obsolete. We need to recognize that. But to address this issue, the key question is how these two systems, now that we have two big blocks of equal power, how are we going to make these two systems coexist without colliding and being able to interact among themselves? And the key question today is what kind of accommodations these two systems will need to be to accommodate each other. So when we say, oh, China is not behaving like a responsible stakeholder, China is not a stakeholder. China, so don't ask China to be a responsible stakeholder when it considers in many domains, and to some extent you can understand their position, that they are not a stakeholder. So I think we need to review some basic assumptions in face of this new reality.
It's very important that you touched upon this because, in fact, India and China converge on several approaches to the IFIs, to the bank and the fund, and even in WTO in the negotiations. So it's not as though China is by itself in wanting to rewrite the rules of the game. So others do have, and across the developing world, these anxieties are shared. So it is easy to lose sight of that when we get caught up in the excitement of events as they unfold in Beijing. I do want to ask you, and also you, Mr. about how to engage with China in the international space and in forums. But before that, Prakash, a question for you. Military budget increase has been announced as part of the two meetings. And the rhetoric also has been amped up to match that increase. And investment in the budget for internal security is also steadily increasing. And those of us who live in China do experience it in very real ways, the increased surveillance and the controls and the restrictions. So we do see this going on. I just want to ask you, is this, you have seen a few administration changes. So is this a new thing? Have you seen this before? And specifically, how is technology going to be used for military purposes?
Quite frankly, I have nothing to do with the military.
Technology.
But first, I'd like to touch upon what Claude said. I think he said it very nicely, which is that global legitimacy comes also from the fact that the Chinese truly believe that the world misunderstands them. The world doesn't look at it from their point of view. And they've been continuously trying to bring that up front. So I think Claude very eloquently talked about that. Yeah, I think it's not just China. Across the world, but military will be entirely on technology. So that's a no-brainer. But like we have seen before, military research helps in technology that happens to us and changes our lives. And which is why I talked about the digital space that China wants to get into in robotics and AI. And we're going to see huge amounts of investments coming in there. They've started with big data. They've declared one particular province as the capital for big data. And the Guizhou. And the investments are amazing. The planning is just unbelievable. We didn't expect that to happen so fast, but they're on the move. No question. And I think neighboring countries like India, who are big in this IT space, would need to sit back and take cognizance.
Thank you, Prakash. And just because you mentioned Guizhou province, NIIT was invited a few years ago, along with other Indian IT companies, to invest in big data. And this is, for brand India in China, we see this as a successful example of leveraging our strengths in the Chinese space and in their investment space. So it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It could also be an opportunity for India to leverage its strengths.
Oh, most certainly. Okay. Most certainly, and we are not doing that. We are not doing that right now. We seem to have we're a little bit of a standoffish thing here. Okay. I think we should engage a lot more.
Okay. And if they invite us in the military space also?
I think so.
Okay.
Yep.
Ryan, I do need to ask you about the R word. Reform. We are all up to our eyeballs with the word reform in China. That's all we've been hearing about for the last 5 years. It's been reform. It's since the 12th five-year plan, we've been talking about reform, comprehensively deepening reform. So what does this mean, Ryan? Does it mean Does it mean deregulation or does it mean party-supervised regulation? What is reform?
I'll get back to that.
Okay.
I worry that we've taken so many steps back that we've actually stopped looking at our shoes a little bit here, though, which is to say that there's sort of two things that just got said from what Claude said and what Prakash said that completely contradict each other. And the first is saying that Xi Jinping wants to be bigger than Mao and is all-powerful. And the second is noting that India successfully engaged with Guizhou on a local reform. It's one example, but this is an incredibly important point. Like, reform, China is not a dictatorship in that sense. One man can want to have power, but he's bound by rules. He does, I know you don't believe he wants to be bound by a collective leadership, and I actually agree with you on that, but he is. You know, if you're an actual dictator, you don't need to go to the Politburo Standing Committee, you go to the Politburo, make a suggestion that then gets passed the National People's Congress saying, now you can be president for life. You tell people, I'm now president for life. And so, to then move to your question on reform, the key thing about what does reform mean in China, it means absolutely everything and anything. You know, it's a complete, what we need to do is actually look at it sector by sector, bit by bit, piece by piece. Because if we keep looking at China and say, well, where does Xi Jinping want reform to go? Xi Jinping speaks in nothing but absolute motherhood statements and generalities. Belt and Road, Industry 4.0. You know, what does that mean? It doesn't have an actual specific meaning. China's actual actions are made up bit by bit, piece by piece, by lots and lots and lots, I mean millions upon millions of people responding to these vague slogans and trying to specify what they mean. And so what reform in essence means in China is a moving feast of people trying to combine a whole bunch of interests at once. One of their interests is getting promoted and keeping food on the table and doing what the party wants, absolutely. Other interests can be to, you know, advance the economy or fix up the schools or push an international agenda. But most of the time, what reform means is really basic stuff like, how do we make sure that the Communist Party is seen as a good government? Yeah? And I mean, Xi Jinping, yes, he uses his own image to do that because he thinks that people will follow what he's doing a lot more. But reform in that sense is this sort of moving feast. Like, so what it means in China then, again, completely depends on the issue, but the most important thing to remember is if we step too far back, if we just say China is this giant monolith, then how do we engage with it? Looking at Xi Jinping and looking at this system as if just one person determines everything, as if one person wants to be the dictator and runs it, means that then you can't actually really reform because everything will be what Xi Jinping says. In that case, they'll never get, you know, why hasn't Xi Jinping done it for the last 5 years? And the reason I'm raising this is not just to be argumentative, although clearly I'm doing that as well, but it's to say that the whole point of this conference is to look at how, you know, geopolitics meets business. If you look at the Chinese system always from this very top down, Xi Jinping is this monolith who wants all the power for himself, and China has this model for the world, and it's amazing, it's beautiful. And then you go to China and you're like, well, you know, you're in some rural town where everyone just cares about putting food on the table. You know, you actually can't see where to get anything done. The opportunities in China come from when the reform interests of one group that are trying to meet this vague mandate contradict the reform interests of another group who are trying to meet another vague mandate, and you arbitrage between them. That's where you can actually get things done in China, right? And so by focusing too much on stepping too far back, I worry that we actually can't get anything done there. You know, we have to look at what we can do practically. And that requires looking at China very carefully, and as Claude says, actually listening to what they say. They'll tell us. It's just they do it in Chinese, and you have to speak the language. And
no,
you have
they have been articulate. In all fairness, they have been quite explicit about what they want to do and where they want to go, and they have set these timelines. It's all pinned up to the wall. The memo has been sent. So they have. You can certainly not accuse them of, you know, being playing cloak and dagger. So,
but it's an interpretation question. I mean, you brought up the French Revolution, and I'm sorry to tell a very quick anecdote. That's a mistranslation. It was Zhou Enlai, not Mao Zedong. And he was asked, you know, what do you think of the French Revolution? But the problem is the word for the French Revolution and the word for the French revolts, as in the student riots of 1968, are the same word. So in 1973, when he said, oh, well, the French Revolution's too soon to tell, he means, yeah, because it happened 4 years ago. That's always the
Claude
issue.
wants to respond.
Go.
Yeah.
It is not a response. I think, again, it is a misunderstanding. We tend to interpret reform as liberalization, deregulation, as what is happening in India, okay? For the Chinese leadership, reform is not changing the system. It is trying to make the system more efficient. And so this is a very strong element that sometimes we don't perceive accurately enough. We expect that through a string of reforms, in a way, and again, we get back to this notion of converging, that you deregulate, you open, and more, quote unquote, they become like us. They have no intention of becoming like us. We have no intention of becoming like them. And so the reform process in China is to make the system more efficient so that it can sustain and it can continue to exist with the party being the only part, if I may say so, of a system. So so we need to judge what they are doing in this light. For instance, just as an example, they have identified financial risk as the three key risks that they need to face, or the three key challenges that they need to face. They are taking a number of measures. Things are moving in that direction because, again, this is a risk that they cannot afford to ignore. Does that mean that, for instance, the financial system of China will become like us? No. Does that mean that the four key banks of China will lose their preeminence? No. Does that mean that in some cases they will continue to subsidize state-owned enterprise? No. If they have to lose $300 billion a year because of the inefficiency of state-owned enterprises, they will try to reduce that to $200 billion, but so be it. It is the cost of doing business. It is the cost of keeping the party where it is. And so I think we need again to understand that notions and concepts and logics are not necessarily the same.
No, I agree with that interpretation. And Ryan, going back to what you said initially about setting himself up, the vulnerabilities and the sensitivities, Xi Jinping having, basically with the anti-corruption campaign, many people are locked up and others have gone underground. So there seems to be no visible opposition, although there are, there are other things going on behind the scenes that we don't see. But the point is, the reform that has happened in the last 5 years with the anti-corruption, but also the other kinds of reforms, systemic reforms that you have mentioned, has in fact enhanced Xi Jinping personally, his prestige and the prestige of his administration, and has incurred trust among the population, among the general public, of course, with a very strong dose of propaganda and with Xi Jinping thought leadership classes every week and all of these on the one hand, but also just with the public perception that something is happening, we have a strong leader at the helm, corruption is under control, things are moving, there is change. There seems to be the perception of change and reform. And I think he is probably banking on this for the legitimacy going forward, but also saying that I don't want to be a lame duck president for the second term and reaping the dividends of the reform. So just a quick question for each of you, and before we open up. Ryan, you said collective leadership is not quite dead in China. Is there a second and third tier of leadership, very briefly?
There are multiple tiers.
Multiple tiers.
There are multiple tiers. And what's very interesting, and again, why I really pushed back on this idea of Xi Jinping, is that each tier as you go down gets more or less delegated so much power that they become like their own government. So there's a central tier, and then there's another tier down of about 30 local governments, and another tier down which is about 800 local governments, and then the final tier down which is almost 3,000 local governments. And so, in essence, each of them is like running its own country. And it's at the 3,000 local governments levels that almost all the spending happens. Actually, they're in the level below, which is about 80,000 local governments. And so you get these multiple tiers that mean that most of the time you don't really care about what's happening anywhere else in the world, and you don't often even care about what's happening in Beijing, but you really care that that guy in the county next to you does not beat you next year, right? So it's it's a system based on competition. And why has that happened? This is the same reason that, you know, I see a lot of nodding heads because people no doubt know about this in the Indian context as well. You know, competition is a really good way to make people do what you want. Because if you spend your life worrying about, you know, your average at that final tier where there's about 3,000, they have 2,000 roughly indicators a year that they are measured on, right? You know, what do you concentrate on every morning? So this is this whole idea of reform, and I really agree with Claude's point, that every now and again you can sit at the top and be like, we only have one reform, or three, you know, it's three at the moment under Hu Jintao, his three pillars: environmental protection, financial risk, and...
Now it's 5.
Yeah, I forget the third anyway.
Ecology and culture.
Bad China
Yeah,
analyst.
yeah.
Hu Jintao did the same thing. And then what that does is every now and again, then people wake up and go, right, okay, I don't need to worry about those 3,000 local governments, each with 2,000 indicators. I just need to worry about making sure my bank doesn't collapse. And the system works quite well. And the rest of the time, it's an absolute disaster because you know, you have all these conflicting incentives down at the local level that make it really hard to know what to do day to day. So China is in essence lots and lots of little governments that are all acting not necessarily autonomously, but acting with so much decentralization and power at the local level that they can more or less do what they want.
No, yes, Ryan, that's very important to emphasize. I mean, words getting thrown around like emperor and dictatorship for life, it distracts from what's actually happening on the ground. So it's good to keep an eye on. There is a system in place, and we may not agree, and we may have differences with it, but something is happening, and there is some reform happening, and the people do perceive it. That's one aspect. Prakash, very quickly for you. Okay, so there is all this anxiety, just with Belt and Road, but also with what's happening in Beijing. And the Indian companies, should we continue to engage? Should Indian business continue to engage in China, continue to invest? And some companies have consistently performed well in the last 25 years, and many others have not. So what should they do to succeed in terms of engagement? Well, the NIIT is been successful consistently. So.
Well, that's a topic of a 6-day seminar.
Yes, it is. It is. No, but it's in 30 seconds.
But, so I'll just take off from where Ryan left. I completely agree with him that it's layers and layers of power in China. Very often in India, I hear people say there's a leader on top and everybody else is a follower. They may be aligned, but they don't necessarily, they have their own powers to do what they need to do. And very often when I've done business in China, we never go to at the central level at all. We always hit the province. And every provincial leader has almost like a business scorecard that we have in our corporate world, which we are measured on at the end of the year on performance. And they're highly incentivized. And that creates competition amongst counties, amongst provinces, and they have the power to do what they need to do. With regard to Indian companies investing in China, I think we should. There was a big, long talk on, for a long, long time, on the balance of trade. We finally concluded that's not the direction to take, but one possible direction is to see how do you get a hungry China to invest in India. And therefore, we started to see that flow a couple of years back. Indian companies must, and I think companies around the globe must invest in China. That's a huge, huge opportunity. In my mind, if you're not in US, Europe, India, and China, you can't really be a world player. So you can't ignore. Why do companies, many companies have done well. Many companies, both in Indian and foreign MNCs, have not done well. And I think there are 3, 4 big reasons. One is the fact that people don't understand China as a huge, huge, huge commitment. You need the time and the bandwidth of your top management. If that is not there, don't even bother. I think that's a big mistake people make. The second is the size of China, and when you go to China and you go visit Shanghai, or you go to the smallest little town, every CEO's tongue comes out, given the infrastructure, given what they've been able to do in the last 20 years. And it's an obvious place to invest. And if you've been successful in 40 other countries, why won't I be successful here? And therefore, you try and bring that arrogance into China. And therefore, you go very often wrong with the business model. And therefore, it fails. There are so many examples. The third big point of failure in companies is they choose the wrong method to enter China. For example, many companies do a joint venture and lose their shirt. Because the Chinese themselves have a saying on this, which is a joint venture is like 2 partners sleeping on the same bed, but having different dreams. So you need to be extremely careful in figuring out how you want to actually go into this nation. The fourth big area is the cultural differences. And then that makes a heck of a difference to the way you do business in China. And there's no book really written on this. And any book written on this is by a foreigner. And therefore, unless you live there and you experience it and speak that language and be with the Chinese, it becomes very difficult to fathom even a business meeting. So, for example, the Chinese never say yes or no. They're far more subtle. So if the guy doesn't want to do a deal with me, he will come 5 minutes late for the meeting. And therefore, I understand that the interest is not so high from their side. And we have delegations from India, which makes me smile, that come 2 hours late. Because to us, it doesn't mean anything more than just being 2 hours late. So trying to understand this and work with the Chinese, understanding that culture, takes time, effort, money, and talent. Therefore, we must be able to invest that. I think that's the key.
Goes to a question of capacity building also, and China is a project, and it goes to capacity building. And Mr. Dawit, I want to ask you about norms and transparency and working with China internationally in forums. How to do it? I mean, at the tactical level, at the strategic level, how to engage with China in international institutions, in forums, in the multilateral space.
Sure. I think I perfectly agree with Claude in that just waiting for the Chinese to converge to our standards and norms, I think it's just a waste of time. But at the same time, the Chinese experienced a very good G20 presidency in 2016. So I think there's a strong will by the Chinese to be seen as a respected international player. And when it comes to Belt Road Initiative and standards and norms, I think if we go to the Chinese and ask them to oblige by the OECD guideline, I think they would never agree because it's not in their interest. But if we can try to engage them in a constructive discussion, dialogue that will also benefit the Chinese, in a sense that making Belt Road Initiative work for everybody and give a BRI a very good name, I think then I guess there's a room for us to engage Chinese in these kind of a constructive discussion. And another thing is that in the past, when we talked about international norms and standards, even under the G20 context, there was a tendency between the discussion would get divided between developed countries and developing countries. But given the recent developments in the Indian neighboring countries, I guess there's a room for countries like India to play a very active and interesting role here, because India is a part of this developing countries, emerging market economy. But I guess it's also in India's interest to agree to a certain set of standards and norms that would bind the Chinese as well. And it could be different from the existing OECD guidelines or the safeguards that we have at the World Bank and ADB and AIIB. But nevertheless, if we can agree, I mean, if India can play a constructive role, engaging both the developed countries and also the Chinese in setting up a new norms and standards, I think that would create a very good opportunity for us to start something new.
That's a very constructive and forward-looking suggestion. I think we'll take a pause right here, and I wanted to ask you the same question, Claude, on how to engage, but we'll come back to that. We'll take questions from the audience now, and of course, you know, the questions may be, are the questions addressed directly to the panelists?
Some
or?
of them.
Okay.
I have a question here, not specified to anybody. How much will the domestic debt problem affect China's expansionist ambitions?
The domestic debt problem. So, Claude, would you like to?
I don't think at this stage that it would play any significant restraining role or limiting role. I think the Chinese are very concerned about the level of a debt, but they do believe that they can manage it. They have the reserves. In the last 12 months, their reserves have again increased after a significant outflow of currency. And in a way, they consider that if they need to increase the debt to maintain a certain level of activity or to expand certain sectors of the economy to achieve their objective, they will continue to do that. This might not be valid 3 years from now, depending on how the economy and the situation evolve. But for the moment, I don't think it does play any significant role.
The Chinese myth that it had dominated the world.
When you're talking about debt as a private sector debt, I think the buildup of private sector debt in China could potentially pose a very serious problem to the Chinese economy. The structural reform agenda was mostly about dealing with the success financial sector problem, but a lot of things has been done, but the credit is still growing. So there's a high risk that eventually this could backfire. But the Chinese have the fiscal resources, so I'm not suggesting that there's going to be any immediate acute problem. But over time, this is something that the Chinese economy will have to deal with, one way or the other.
I was talking about the public debt. Now, the private debt, the corporate debt, the government is really, really working hard at it. And what we have seen with what happened with Ambang, as an example, is a way to really curb the excesses and the hubris of a number of big conglomerates.
Talking about multiple tiered systems, how does India build tiered layers of engagement with China on areas to cooperate, to coexist, to conflict, and agree to disagree? This question is for Mr. Prakash.
See, if you look at the provinces, if you look at cities and provinces, as Ryan said, they compete with each other. And that's your sweet spot. So very often companies go to the central government and things go on for 6 months and nothing happens. You need to go to a province and understand if what you do is part of their vision for the next 3-4 years. And if it is, then you envision something along with the government. Your best pal in China is the government. And as long as you're not doing things where they feel you're going to eat from their plate, you'll be fine. So there will be certain areas where you would compete, there would be certain areas that you would collaborate, and they're fine with it. So they had so many problems with Japan in the past, but Japan is their second largest trade partner. every Chinese will have a Japanese product at their homes. This tells us they're able to compartmentalize many things. So if you ask in India, how many of us own something from Pakistan? We don't seem to compartmentalize, but the Chinese do that very, very well. So certain areas we will cooperate extensively, certain areas we will compete, certain areas, they're fine with that.
So given that China has been selective about its compliance in the international system, do you believe that the participating countries in the BRI should be worried about China's military ambitions along with its rise? And should we put to rest the concept of PRC, peacefully rising China?
By the BRF. Was that, sorry?
PRC,
BRC.
peacefully rising China.
Right. That's very clever. I think many a micro makes a macro. And so we need to deal with the Chinese system as accurately as possible. I don't think if you look at any country's intentions that you can look and be like, this is going to be good or bad or whatever. And there are definitely issues with the Chinese government in the international community where there will be significant disagreements, and that's not going to change. I completely agree with Claude's point there. You know, we need to be quite selective in that sense about what is to be yielded on and what isn't to be yielded on. I think, though, that the one overarching thing we need to be also careful on is not blowing up the Chinese threat. Dealing with China often reveals more about our own countries than it does about China. China's a very useful sort of bogeyman to look at. Because if you want any example of anything, I guarantee you spend 5 minutes searching in Chinese for it and you'll find it. It's a country, again, India is not dissimilar in my limited understanding of it. It's a country where every time you look at it, you can pick up whatever you want to see. And so I think what's actually more important is that we're clearer, both within our countries domestically and also within like-minded countries, as to what we're engaging on, what we want to get out of it. And then the final part is Prakash touched on already, is that if you're dealing with Chinese international system, you need to use their system against themselves, so to speak. I mean, they have the same internal rivalries and competitions and problems that all governments have. And so if you want to if you're having troubles with the Silk Road Fund, which is run by the NDRC, go to the AIIB. You know, they're actually run by different ministries. Maybe you get some more give there, maybe you get some more give than you would in another part. And I think that's probably where I'm more optimistic than most.
China is certainly offering an alternative governance model, an alternative economic models, and there appear to be fans around the world, and there is a new self-confidence where they're offering these models. But just the question of militarization along the Belt and Road, I think there is some anxiety there for militarization along the Belt and Road with the private armies and the contractors.
Belt and Road is difficult because in the Chinese system, until last year, the end of last year, when it was put into the National Party Congress statement, there was actually no cover given to anyone who wanted to sign off on a Belt and Road deal. In other words, if you had any sort of military operation, you wouldn't have the support of the central government behind you because no one had issued the documents that gave them the clearance or that made things possible. That doesn't mean that Belt and Road can't cause problems because, of course, when you have a bucket load of money going into a country, it changes that country's internal dynamics and internal politics. That would be the same no matter the country that was doing it. Belt and Road so far, though, is a rebadging exercise. It's not an actual investment exercise. There have been 3 only sort of homogenous Belt and Road deals that are developed through the full and proper Belt and Road process only. I mean, even when you count up all the things that have been rebadged, my personal favourite was the railway, which was finished recently in Rwanda, and they had the engineer up on the national TV being like, this is a triumph for the Chinese people, only China could manage this. And this is a triumph for the Belt and Road. And so I went back and I looked at when they started building this railway in Rwanda, and it was in 1987. The Belt and Road was announced in 2013. So,
it's all been folded in.
Exactly. Everything's being lumped under Belt and Road. So all of my comments on China mostly also apply to the Belt and Road.
And I'm afraid that's all we have time for, although there are many, many questions, but then the panelists are right here amongst us, so I think we can continue these conversations. Akshay, do we have time for one final word from... No? Okay, none. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Because I'm moderating the next session. Thank you very much.